Why do we preach?
It's fun. Sorry, that's not the answer.
What's the purpose for preaching? When you were asked to preach, did you ever pause for a minute, 10, 30, 60 and say, what am I trying to achieve with my sermon? Not the topic, but your overall purpose. And if you have, what would it be? Why do we get up to preach? What are we trying to achieve? Okay, share. Let's put a share. Oh, that's nice and bright. Okay, share. What else?
Address issues.
Okay, issues.
All about Jesus.
Sorry?
All about Jesus.
Okay. Jesus, yep.
Conversion.
To convert.
Inspire change.
Inspire. Change.
God's goodness in your life.
Pardon?
Goodness of God in your life.
Goodness of God. Good God. Anything else? Testimony. One or two more? Any other reasons why we preach? Inspire. Oh, we've got that already, but
I mean difference, not inspire change.
inspiration.
Yeah.
Yep.
By the Spirit.
Yep. Any others? I'm going to share with you why I think it is important and incredibly valuable for us to preach.
Sometimes you need to correct as well.
Sometimes you need to correct. Yep.
Share the good news.
Good news. Good news. Why do I think it's important to preach? And it includes elements of all of these. Every time we get up to preach, our key aim, our primary focus is to move people. If we preach and people don't move, they're here before the sermon and after the sermon, we hope that they have moved, transformed, experienced the change here. If after the sermon they are exactly where they were, what do we call that kind of content? What do we call it when you watch something and you enjoy it, but it doesn't move you? Entertainment. It's entertainment. How many of you watched a movie and you said, that was a great movie, and then you go about your daily lives and nothing has changed? Is preaching for entertainment? Can it entertain? It can, but is that the purpose of it? No, our purpose is to move, to transform lives. And it might not be such a big transformation that you don't recognize them, but it's to at least move people one step further than where they were before the sermon. Does that make sense? What is the best way to move people? Now I'm going to share with you about a guy who asked this same question. This color's a lot better actually. Who asked this same question about 100 years ago. And he spent time studying thousands of people and how they responded to content, to talks, to pictures, to sermons, to all sorts of things. And what he's done is that he didn't invent anything new. He simply looked at how humans respond to being encouraged to change or to transform or to move. And he came up with a very basic process, and he said, this is what happens. When people go on this journey, change happens. When they don't go on this journey, at best they're entertained, at worst they're bored. And he called this the motivational sequence because it moves people. You can Google it, you can find it. It's not rocket science, it's fairly straightforward and it's simple. So we're going to go through this sequence. How do we move people? Now, when I was at college, I came across this from my homiletics lecturer, Dr. Graham Bradford, and he shared this with us, which was very unique, interesting. I'd never heard it that way. But before him, most homiletics, most preaching teachers would share that you structure a sermon like this. You have an introduction, and then what do you have? 3 points, and then you have a conclusion. Now that sounds exactly like what else that you do at uni. It sounds like an essay. And most of us are essaying instead of preaching. And I thought that was amazing, but then I got out into the real world and I started preaching like that, and I discovered a couple of things. I discovered that usually people fell asleep before I even finished the introduction. I discovered that with my 3 points, a week later, I couldn't remember my 3 points. And so if I can't remember my 3 points, what hope do my members have? They're probably not going to remember my 3, let alone 1. I discovered that essays don't usually keep people engaged, and if they're not engaged, are they going to move? They're not going to move. And I discovered that people were far more familiar with the record than with my sermons, which is why now I don't give the record before the sermon. If they're not going to listen, they can be bored. I'm not giving them an easy way out. And initially, publish it in the record. Initially, I was very reluctant and resistant to try this. I thought, it's nonsense, it's rubbish. Everyone's been doing the intro, 3 points, and conclusion. I did that. So I did it for a few years, didn't work, and I thought, something's got to change. Maybe my professor actually was onto something. And I tried this and I found that it did 2 things. It created far more engagement and it reduced my prep time significantly. I was spending minimum 8 to 10 hours in preparing a sermon. How many of you have 10 hours a week to prepare a sermon? How many of you just say, I've got nothing else to do, let me preach? Now, I'm a local church pastor. I don't have 10 hours every week, which means that I have to steal those 10 hours from 10 p.m. Friday night to 8 a.m. Saturday morning. That's where I find my extra 10 hours. And so by 8 o'clock in the morning, I finished it. I turn up to church and I even fall asleep before I start preaching my own sermon. So how do we move people in an engaging way and in a way that isn't going to take me and you 10 hours? If you're Dwight Nelson, and Dwight Nelson, when he was a pastor of Pioneer Memorial Church, he had usually 10 supporting pastoral staff that were paid. And his job every week was to do what? Craft one sermon. So he had 40 hours a week to craft a sermon. Good on him. I don't have that time. You don't have that time. So what does the motivational sequence involve? The first step where we're starting is attention. That can be anywhere between 2 to 5 minutes. It means that we start by engaging people's brains. How do we do that? Well, let me give you an example of what I observe when I see other people preach at churches. And this happens to VPs and EPs. Oh, good morning. Happy Sabbath, everybody. This week's been really busy. It's been stressful. It's been tense. There's been a lot on. And, I haven't really had a lot of time to prepare. And, look, just bear with me. Have you ever seen people do that up the front? They start with an apology. They've basically told you the next half an hour is going to be rubbish. I think it's rubbish. It probably will be rubbish. Therefore, don't bother wasting your time. Is that engaging? You know what? If that is the truth and you haven't had time to prepare, just don't tell people. Let them judge you on it. And some of them, you'll get away with it, right? Some won't realize. You don't start with an apology because straight away, how will people's brains react to that? They're going to shut down. They're going to turn off. This isn't interesting. He doesn't believe in what he's about to share. She's already bored of her own sermon. No point listening. Or another way that people do it. Okay, open your Bibles to. Now, some people connect well with that, but more than half of the congregation, when you start by saying open your Bibles to, what do most people's brains do? They actually switch off because it's not that engaging. Now, I remember growing up and people would come from the conference, departmentals, presidents, administrators, and they would start a sermon like this. I bring you greetings from the union. Salutations from the conference office. What happens to people's brains when we commence a sermon like that? Who's the union? What do I care about them? Right? Which is, if you've noticed, when I come to preach at your churches, the minute I get up, I do not start with greetings and salutations and apologies and excuses and open your Bibles to and anything that is going to make you fall asleep before we even get into it. So how do we get people's attention from the very first word you say up? Don't even say good morning and happy Sabbath and hello. Don't even do that. Why not? The moment we hear something familiar, what do our brains do? They just slow down. They go to sleep. They switch off. So don't start with the familiar. What's the best way to engage or attract people's attention when we want to move them? Stories. Now, I shared this at camp, and a few of you were there for the worship, but most of you weren't. Over the last 20 years, they've done some amazing research on how our brains respond to information. You can Google this, how stories impact our brain. And what they've discovered is when we hear things that are informational, academic, just content rather than stories, our brain hears it, interprets it, makes sense of it, and then discards it. You with me? Which is why we might hear a lecture or a talk at uni or a theologically heavy sermon, and what happens as soon as we process, interpret, make sense of it, and then what? It simply goes, it disappears. But when we hear stories, your brain hears it, and your brain starts to change and synchronize with the story and with the storyteller, leaving a permanent imprint, usually for the rest of your life. Which is why when Jesus preached, he did so with? What are parables? They're stories. Some were true, some were made up. Stories. It changes our brains. It wakes us up. It makes us sit up in our chairs. So the very first thing you want to do when you get up is start by sharing a story. Are you with me so far? 2 to 5 minutes. It could be a story from your own experience. How do you find stories? Well, reading helps. Read widely. Read books. Listen to audio books. You can get a lot for free from free libraries. The news. There are stories in the news. How many of you are familiar with any stories in the news over the last 7 days? Tell me a story in the news. Fire in Sydney. What was that one? Ben Robert Smith. That's a story. And there's a lot of richness in that story that you could draw on multiple different topics, whether it's the court case or the crimes or reputation. There are 50 story topics there. Karen Folbig was in the news recently. Joe Biden tripped and fell over.
I was just going to say that.
There are stories all around us, right? Now, most people have a casual reading of the news, but they don't know the stories well. And so if you spend about 5 minutes actually reading the news article rather than the clickbait title, you will know more than most people in your audience about that story. Where was Joe Biden when he fell? What was he doing there? Where was his security?
He was right there.
Okay. If you know the story, share a little bit more. Most of your members don't know the details. It's going to make it a bit interesting. So start with getting attention. Does that make sense? Yeah? Good. Have you noticed that when you watch a movie, they don't start with the credits usually anymore? Do you remember I watched Ben-Hur? That was the only Sabbath movie we could watch growing up. And you spent 10 minutes on credits at the beginning. Why don't they do that anymore? They had a captive audience there because it was the only movie around. Now when they're competing, if you give people 10 minutes of credits at the beginning, nobody's going to watch the movie. So they get your attention. Okay, the next part, and this is crucial, this is probably what we need to think through first, even though we don't preach it first. The need, maybe 1 to 3 minutes. What's the need? If we're sharing on a topic or a theme that people aren't interested or that doesn't address a need in their lives, what are they going to do when we start preaching? Okay, let me ask you a question. How many of you, if I was selling nappy bags, how many of you would be interested?
No.
One? Why is he interested? Why is he remotely interested? Because he's got a baby. The rest of you, you couldn't care less. You're going to switch off, right? So if I'm addressing a need that isn't relevant to any of you, you're going to turn off. You're not going to listen because I'm answering a question you're not asking. I'm solving a problem you don't have. And we default back to what? The record or the bulletin. That was way back. Now people don't default to the record. What do they default to? Facebook, Instagram, this or that. And they all pretend that they're reading their Bibles. They put it on dark mode so it looks dark, like as if it's a Bible. I know what you're doing and you know what you're doing. No internet access. That's okay. People download content from home. I know what. There are ways of getting around that. So we need to address the need. What is the question? Now let me give you an example. You help me out. What are some of the needs in your local churches? The members that you know, your family, your friends, your colleagues, members that sit next to you in the pew. What are they in your local churches? Tell me, what are the needs, the spiritual needs? What are their spiritual needs? What are the spiritual needs in the lives of the people in our congregations? Okay, busy to do what? Okay, so the need might be, I know I need to, but how do I make time? How do I prioritize this? Yeah? How do I deal with the business of life while still trying to maintain a spiritual connection. That's a need. A lot of people have that. Any other needs?
We need to encourage
Most people feel like they're failing in life.
Okay, I feel discouraged. I'm a failure. Things just don't work. How do I work through that? Yeah.
Yeah, so I need to encourage
I
people.
need to encourage them because they're discouraged. So the need is I'm discouraged for various reasons. It might be because I'm going through difficult times. It might be because I just don't know what to do with my life. And you know your members better than I do, so you get to know people. If you don't know what needs your church members have, how can you find out?
It's like we come here to be encouraged because we're a bit down.
Well, yeah, so we're addressing a need.
Yes.
This weekend is us talking to our EPs and our EPs saying our elders, our VPs have a need. And so we create a weekend to address that need. How do we know our members' needs? Someone made a comment?
Visitation.
Okay, visitation is a great way. How else can we get to know our members and what they're going through? Lunch with them, eat meals. You can do that at church, in the picnic, in the park, at home. Yeah, how else? Facebook, yeah, follow them, stalk them on Facebook. You'll discover all of their needs. Anything else? Talk to them before church. Talk to them between Sabbath school and church. Talk to them after church. Just have conversations with people. And because you are all quality VPs, you probably already know the needs in your local churches, right? Because you talk to people. You know where they're going, what they're going through. You know where they're at. So we're going to ask a question. We've gotten their attention, and we have a question: how do I get through discouragement? How do I get through a sense of failure? How do I connect with God in the hustle and bustle of a busy life with children and a mortgage and work and bills? And then on top of that, all these things at church we've got to do. How do we break through to have a meaningful, relevant, spiritual, exciting life, spiritual life, the way Jesus did and the disciples did, where they were willing to lay down their lives for it? That's the need. So that's the question. The next part is I'm going to satisfy that need or solve the problem. Satisfaction or solution, both start with S. So we're going to start looking for a solution. Now, we are at church, we are addressing spiritual issues. Where do we find solutions for spiritual issues? Where does my solution come from? The Bible. My solution comes from the Bible. So I've gotten their attention. We've highlighted the need we're addressing. I'm not giving them the answer here. I'm just giving them the question we're trying to address. Why should I pray? Why should I do evangelism? How do I have a better relationship at home with my spouse, with my children? How do I share my faith? How do I get through difficulty? How do I forgive? All these sort of questions. And then I say, well, let's explore that question in this particular Bible passage. Now, we've already talked about it. What kind of Bible passage is the best to preach on? Stories. Because Jesus spoke in parables, which are stories. Now, you may be an academic and a theological genius. Hallelujah. Praise the Lord. That's not me. And I've tried it and it doesn't work and people fall asleep. For you, it might work. For most people that are human like me, sharing a story, hearing a story is going to be more relevant than trying to dissect Romans chapter 11. Which is beautiful, it's wonderful. Do it in a group Bible study, do it in your personal time. But you get up and you start going through that and you start dissecting and exegeting and expounding and doing this and that, and what's going to happen to most of your audience? They're not bad people. They're good people. Our brains just aren't hardwired to hear public lectures, deep, heavy, theological, academic topics. You may be a superstar whiz like a Dwight Nelson who can do it. Most of us can't, so I would say don't waste your time trying to do that. So find a biblical story. We're a bit discouraged. What Bible story can give me encouragement and why? What Bible story tells me what to do when I'm discouraged? Give me some examples. Which one's that? Okay, Esther, she's discouraged, she's struggling, she's worried. How does God help her resolve it? What does she do? Some other stories of discouragement. Elijah, Joseph, Moses, discouraged. Jesus, discouraged. David. Yeah. So pick a story that resonates with you that you can link to. Now, what is the best way to expound on these stories? If you just read it, it's one thing. Or if you do just a running commentary, maybe it's not as engaging. How could you take one of these stories and bring them to what we would call life? How can you make it unique and interesting so that your audience engage with the story instead of just, I've heard the Joseph story. I've heard the Elijah story. What do you do? You can connect them, and we'll come to a testimony in a minute. There are two things we can do. One is to exegete. Have you ever heard the term exegesis? It just means to help people understand the story in its original context. What was happening in the lives of the people there? What was happening historically? I mean, let's look at the story of Joseph. Does he have reason to be discouraged? He does. How much was he sold for? 30. What was the equivalent? What else could you buy for 30 pieces of silver back then? Anyone know? Okay, if you don't know, how can you find out? Google it. ChatGPT. This is really simple. You don't need a huge library of theological books. You can find it online. It's easy. So bring the story to life by saying, you know, his brothers, his very own brothers. Here's what you can do. You can actually find two children, get them up the front, because we're using illustrations. We're bringing the story to life. Hey, Ben and Megan, come up the front. Now, Ben, I want you to look at Megan. Megan's not here. But Ben, have a look at Megan. Two brothers. Have a look. Now, it has to be real. Yeah, you're close enough. Your brother's from another mother, so it doesn't work. But look at each other and say, now, I want you to imagine what it would be like if this sister here of yours just basically took 30 pieces of silver, which is the equivalent to a pair of what? A pair of high fancy Armani shoes, and just said, I'll trade you in for a pair of shoes. Visualize it. People won't forget that as easily as 30 pieces of silver. And every time you see Ben and Megan from now on, what are you going to remember? You're going to remember that he is worth a Louis Vuitton bag, right? What have we done? We've personalized it, we've contextualized it, this is what it meant back then, and we've also translated it into what it means now. Okay, so Joseph gets sold into slavery, and he has to walk. Where was he, and how far did he walk? Does anybody know? Okay, did he ride a camel back to Egypt? You think they put slaves on camels? No way. So he's walking. What is happening where he's walking? How cold does it get at night? Do you think they gave him a nice swag that was rated for minus 14 degree weather? Okay, how cold, how warm does it get during the day? How far was it? Do you think they just let him loose? No, he's chained, he's walking. How hot, how cold, how long did it take? You're really helping people experience what Joseph was going through. Who could he talk to? They didn't even speak the language. He couldn't message anybody, he couldn't call home. They didn't know where he was. What does the future hold for him? What does he know about Egypt? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. So you're bringing the story to life. He gets taken to a slave market. What were slave markets like back then? How did they treat slaves? What did the Egyptians do with slaves? How did slavery operate in Egypt? Why are we asking all these questions? We're bringing the story to life with pieces of the story that aren't readily available in the verse, but we can learn literally with 10 minutes of Googling. That's all it's going to take to get a little bit of context about what happened there. Potiphar, Potiphar's wife. What was it like to be upper society? What did they wear? What did they dress? What games did they play? We're bringing it to life. So Potiphar just isn't this, benign Bible character, but we're actually helping people get to know who Potiphar was, what was he like, what authority he had. Why is it that when Joseph rejected Potiphar's wife, he gets sent to jail and not killed? Okay, so bring that point to life, Now I want you to put yourself in his shoes. Who's the equivalent? Can you imagine you've got, someone like the Vice President of America or a corporation or Australia, he gets a migrant that comes from overseas cleaning the house and he's accused of raping, Anthony Albanese's wife. Right? You're contextualizing, you're helping people relate this biblical story to what it can look like. And that's not hard to do once you get a little bit of practice, because you're just asking some questions that the text doesn't reveal. And are you allowed to use your imagination? Yeah, you're allowed to use your imagination. And if the facts are a little bit stretched, we're not here. We're telling a story. We're not here giving an encyclopedia reference. Are you with me? We're helping people connect with the story.
Christian, you want at least 2 or 3 sources to...
Look up 2 or 3 sources, yeah.
Could be wrong.
Don't take the first Google one. Look up 2 or 3 sites that say something similar, or talk to your EP, talk to me, and we can even help you work through which sources are a bit more credible than others. Yeah. If it's a MySpace page, it's not credible. Okay, so don't go to MySpace. Look for something different. But that takes a little bit of practice and experience. And if you say Joseph was 7'5" and you got it wrong, people won't really care and they'll forgive you for that, because we're telling a story. This isn't an academic reference. So our story or our solution comes from the Bible story. You with me so far? Okay, so once we've shared, this is what Joseph went through, and how did God get him through this? How did God help him with his discouragement or with the particular needs that were highlighted? The next part is visualization. What does this mean? You are helping members to see how this solution or satisfaction can work in the life of a human being they can relate to. And who is the best person that they can relate to? This is basically a testimony of how this solution helped someone. Who's the best person to share a story or to share a story about here?
Real person.
Which real person?
Your own.
Your own. This is an opportunity to share your testimony. So I too was discouraged. I too felt let down like Joseph. And I too did what Joseph did, or I learned to do what Joseph did. And this is what happened in my life. This is how God answered my prayers. This is how God came through for me in the midst of darkness. If you are leading people to somewhere you have not been, will they follow? They will know right away that you're basically just sharing hot air. So your testimony is powerful. Now, there may be some particular topics that you might not have experienced directly for various reasons, or maybe there is a story, a testimony of a friend, a brother, a colleague, or someone you know that is more relevant. It's not bad to share someone else's testimony, but someone that people can relate to. Someone that might still be alive or in recent history. So here I'm just sharing another testimony. He did it for Joseph. He did it for me. And what's the implication? He can do it for you. We're going on a journey, and I am wanting to move you by telling you what God has done in the past, what He's done in the present, and what He can do in the future for you. Past, today me, tomorrow He can do it for you. The last thing we want to do is an application or an action step. And you know what? You can call these things whatever you want. It doesn't really matter. It's the process that counts. If we've moved people through all of these steps, but we don't invite them to do something, what have we done? We've what? Entertain them. That's all entertainment is. You watch a good movie, and seldom does a movie make you go and do anything, does it? Oh, that was nice. We'll watch another one. And they go about their business, they go to lunch, they do this, they do that, and they've forgotten. We want to invite people, we want to challenge them and ask them to do something. But what we want to do is be careful that we don't challenge them to do something that is so hard, so difficult, so impossible that they give up right away. I couldn't do that. Okay, I've shown you how to do Bible studies. This week, you go and give a Bible study. How many members are going to do that likely? Because it's too many steps away from where they are. Does that make sense? But it might be, okay, we've talked about giving Bible studies. We're going to do something really simple this week. As a church, we've bought 100 of the Bible marking guides, and they're at the back of the church. And I am going to give you one on the way out. And this week, I want you, just in your family or at home by yourself, to read that first one. Just read it, so you can capture the simplicity of this particular Bible study. Do you think that's easier to do? That's more likely. And what we've done is we've moved people from here, where they've never given a Bible study and they don't know what a Bible study looks like, to here, where what are they doing now? They know what a Bible study looks like. Is that better than where they were half an hour ago? It sure is. Are they more likely to move here than to move over there? They sure are, because next week when I preach, or in a month or in two, I know that most of them have read a Bible study. And now that they've read one Bible study, I can give them the next step. And I'm thinking of the next step and the next step, until ultimately we've gone through 100 steps, and all of a sudden we've got church members giving Bible studies because they know how to find contacts and they're excited to share the Bible. Whatever activity or challenge or application you give, make sure that it's easily doable for most of your people and they can do it within 7 days. If they can't do it that week, are they likely to do it? They'll forget. And give them a cue that can help them remember. So, okay, right now, I want you all to take your, give me just a second. I want you to take your phones out and put a reminder in your phones. Or, right now, Meryl and Ben, I want you to find a person next to you that you get along with, and I want you to exchange phone numbers and make a commitment that Monday morning or Tuesday night or whenever works, you're going to spend 2 minutes praying for this person or for this issue. Or you're going to spend 2 minutes just reading this Bible verse together. That's it. Can you do that? Do it right now. You've got a minute to exchange. So what am I doing? I'm giving people something they can do, and also I'm helping them have some accountability in place by getting them to do it together. How do I have a good relationship at home? Well, good relationships start not by receiving, but by giving. And the last time you gave your spouse something was in 1943. This week we're going to do something really simple, right? I'm not even sending you to the news agency. I have bought post-it note packs for all of you. You're going to get a post-it note on the way out. And this week, I want you to write now to set a reminder, sometime during the week, anytime during the week, to write your significant other a post-it note with something other than a shopping list. What are we doing? We're taking people from doing nothing for each other to doing something really simple. It's one small step, moving them further. Now, it does depend on the need. Some of them might be like, don't jump off a cliff today. That's a huge thing. But for most of our members, it's constantly moving them closer and closer to Jesus, to trusting Him. This week, I want you to do something. Now, we say, I don't know if I'm saved, and I constantly struggle with fear and with doubt. There is an incredibly powerful book and beautiful passage that talks about this. You can download it on your phone. We've got some copies at the back for those that don't have phones. I want you to go and read page 73 from Steps to Christ, How to Deal with Discouragement. And just read that and put a calendar reminder and actually read it with your spouse, read it with a friend, and see what impact that has in your faith life. Can you see what we're doing? It's constantly inviting and challenging people at the end of every sermon, every talk we give, to put what they're doing into practice. And ideally with some accountability where possible. Sometimes it's not possible. Now, will all of our members do that? No. Is the Spirit moving in people's lives? Yeah. And the ones that are open and receptive, He will take them on that journey and they will start to take a step. And when they take one step, the next step is easier and the next step is easier. Sometimes we try to move out people too many steps and wonder why nobody follows. Well, you might be able to sprint, but maybe nobody else can sprint quite yet. So just start going for a walk. Take people on a walk before you're running 100-meter sprints versus Usain Bolt. Now, I want you to have a look at this. What did we say? What literary device are we using here? What's this? Story? Okay, story over here. Okay, and this is a question. We've got one question here. This is the question that we start with. What literary device are we using here? Story. We're telling a Bible story and learning to bring it to life. What literary device are we using here? It's a testimony or a story. Okay, and here is just a question. Will you do this? Or a challenge. Do this week. So what is our sermon composed of? A question here and a question here. And story, story, story. How hard is it for you to remember a good story? It's pretty easy. And if you forget some of the details when you're sharing a story, does anybody care? Which is why when you're telling a story, you don't need notes for it. Because it's a story. And don't worry about the details. When I get up to preach, I read a fair bit. I read a story. I read the Challenger story. Do you know how many details in that Challenger story I wanted to share? Yeah. And guess what? I forgot 90% of them. Did you know that? Do you care? Does it matter? Did you get the main point of the story?
A good story.
The main point of the story was they knew something was going wrong. It was an O-ring and things went wrong.
You found an O-ring yesterday or something looked like an O-ring.
There you go. There you go. So don't stress about the details. You don't have to have notes for your stories. Where do you find the notes for this story? In the Bible. So you don't need notes for that one because the story is in the Bible. And as you're reading it together up the front and you've read a little bit of history, it will trigger, oh yeah, slavery. Oh, let me tell you about slavery. Oh yeah, he went from this place to that place because he was in Dothan or wherever he was. And it's actually triggering. So you don't need that many notes for the details. And if you forget some details, does it matter? It doesn't matter because nobody else knows that you've forgotten some details. Are you with me? This one here, how hard is it to remember your own story? Or someone's powerful testimony that's impacted your life? Is that hard? It's pretty easy, isn't it? Can you see why you don't need a lot of notes? Yeah, you can have some notes, especially as you are starting, and your notes are fairly sparse. Remember this story, here's the question. Remember that story, here's the Bible passage. Remember my testimony, and here's a question. So your notes could literally fit on a, half of an A5 page with a little bit of text on there. Now, How long do you think it takes to think through some stories? 8 hours? I'll tell you how it works for me. When I'm driving, I'm praying and I'm saying, Lord, give me some stories. When I'm reading stories, I'm like, that's a good story, right? The Challenger story, I got that from some of my studies in my MBA. And I read it about a year ago and I remember the story. And so when I was thinking of the need, what was the need here? The need was about faith, something as small as a mustard seed. I thought, what stories do I know when things went wrong in a very small way that had catastrophic consequences? And guess what came to mind? The Challenger story. So it took me about 3 minutes to Google what went wrong with the Challenger. And I read a little bit about the Challenger, and I can share with you a little bit of knowledge on the Challenger. That doesn't take long. The Bible stories, well, I'm reading my Bible and I'm getting the stories. So it doesn't take me a huge amount to think of the stories. The testimony, well, I'm just thinking, when has this changed my life or changed somebody else's life? Which is why, as you do this a few times, it will go from 10 hours to maybe 8 to maybe 5 to maybe 4 to, I don't think I spend more than half an hour ever crafting a sermon. It usually takes a bit longer to put the PowerPoint together. And if I don't have time to do a PowerPoint, what happens? We don't have a PowerPoint because Jesus didn't have PowerPoint, and stories usually hold their own without a PowerPoint. But PowerPoints help. It's a nice visual aid. It helps keep the flow going. Are you with me? So we're going to do an example right now. We're going to craft a sermon together, and you can time to see how long it's going to take us to craft a sermon. So I want someone to give me a need that is real and genuine in your local church that we haven't discussed already. Give me a need that we're going to craft a sermon for. What need? What are the challenges, the problems, the tensions, the spiritual issues that some of you members may be going through? Anyone? So, what was that? A need, a problem, an issue. Someone else says? Willingness to what? Sorry? To be involved. Willingness to be involved, okay? How would we phrase that into a need? What is the need that members have? Is it that they want to be involved and that they don't have time? Or is it that they're just lazy or indifferent or don't care?
Maybe indifferent.
Okay, so they're indifferent. Okay, how do we phrase that into a need? This is what I would do with that sort of need. Okay, have you ever read your Bibles where Jesus says, go and make disciples? Go and says, go do mission, go tell others. And so you read that, you hear about that. Pastors come up and preach all the time we should do mission, but deep down inside, how do you really feel? You don't feel like doing it, do you? Let's be honest with each other. You don't have time, you're busy, you don't care. And you know what? God's big enough, let him do it. How do we deal with this tension where the Bible tells us to do something, but we don't feel like it? And is that okay? And what should we do? And does this impact my salvation? Is it even an issue? Why are pastors harping on about it? Why are elders harping on about it? Why do I still feel guilty about not doing it, but I don't feel like doing it? Do you think our members can relate to that sort of need? What have we done in a minute or two? We've helped create a question of a problem, a real issue that our members are going through. Most of our members are going through that, right? And then I might even say, and I feel like I should, but I don't, well, I know I should, I don't feel like doing it, should I even bother?
I don't think it's my gift.
I don't think it's my gift. Okay, so you know your audience, but what we've done is we've basically said, what's the need? The need is, how do I either care or should I care? Should I care about doing mission? Maybe that's a better question. Should I bother? Does that make sense? Why should I bother? When God is big enough, strong enough, mighty enough, and he's got his angels, and hey, I'm busy. Got a mortgage to pay and children to raise and a farm to look after and a job to do. Why bother with evangelism or with mission? Can you see what we've done? We've created a need. So we've got the need here, 1 to 3 minutes. Now attention. What story can I share to get their attention? Can you think of any stories? Anything interesting?
Moses.
Sorry?
Moses.
No, not the Bible story yet, just an interesting, engaging story. Now I'm going to make this up, and I haven't used this before, so I'm going to make it up right now as an example. And this is probably a more challenging topic. When you're preparing a sermon, start with something easier. But I might start with, how many of you know about the funny bone? The funny bone. Have any of you heard about the funny bone? How many of you have ever experienced being hit in the funny bone?
It's not funny.
It's not funny. The funny bone is not funny. How do you feel when you hit yourself in the funny bone? What do you feel like doing? That's why it's called the funny bone. What do you feel like doing? Crying, but also what? It's actually mixed. It's sort of, that's what they call it, the funny bone. You want to cry, you want to laugh, you just don't know. It's just this odd sensation that you've never experienced. What's the anatomy or physiology of a funny bone? Anyone know that? I don't know it either, so I'd Google it. Why does the funny bone give that sensation? And I'd talk for about 2-3 minutes about the funny bone and see if I can even find a story about the guy who called it the funny bone, right? So I'm talking about the funny bone. And we've given a little bit of science. This is 2, 3, 4 minutes on the funny bone and the guy that discovered it. See if you can find your funny bone. You're making people see if you can tap it. Have you noticed you can't ever hit your funny bone? Try hit your funny bone. Have you noticed you can't hit your funny bone? It always happens without you wanting it to happen, right? It always happens by accident. You can't actually say, let me hit my funny bone. Try it. Now maybe you can, I'm just making this up, but you get the point, right? You get the point of what we're doing? Okay? So I said the funny bone. Now, you know what? My experience with evangelism is a little bit like the funny bone. Because I don't know whether to laugh or cry. I don't know whether to do it or not to do it. I don't know how I should feel. I actually feel, I know I should, but I don't. I don't feel like it. I don't have time. I don't have willingness. I get home, I'm tired. But then the pastor says I should be doing evangelism. This is the funny bone experience. And it's not me doing it to myself. It's the pastor's fault because he preaches on evangelism every time he gets up. What do we do with those sorts of emotions? How do we deal with it? How do we work through that sort of problem? Can you see what we just did? Yeah. Okay. Bible answer to that. What solution? Why do we do evangelism? What motivates us? What gets us doing evangelism? Give me a story.
Jonah.
Okay, Jonah. We can go to the Jonah story. Yeah? Yeah. Any other stories? Gideon. Philip. Yeah, you can craft a story. Now, I love the Philip and Ethiopian sermon, and you've heard me preach on it just because there's so much richness in the history behind that. Most people don't know where Ethiopia was, and there's just so much to unpack that brings the story to life. Jonah, there's so much to unpack in Jonah about the Assyrians. You know, people just preach on Jonah and never talk about the Assyrians. What do you know about the Assyrians? Mind-boggling to think that they were a more powerful and richer empire than the Babylonians. If you look at the city of Nineveh, just astounding. If you look at how they used to torture people, they used to come into town, and for the towns that surrendered, they would sometimes kill half the men, cut their heads off, and create a pyramid. And that was for the ones that surrendered at the front of the town. So when people walked past the town, they would see a pyramid made up of heads and say, well, that's for surrendering. Imagine if you don't surrender. Right? They had a moat around Nineveh that was so deep and so wide that you literally couldn't cross it. Nineveh and the Assyrians did not collapse because of external forces. They collapsed because of internal forces. Right? Now, where do you get that from? Google. Like, it's right there. So you bring the story to life. Any other stories about finding a willingness? Okay, Moses. His desire not to, and then what God did for him. Basically, he says, I don't have the gifts, I don't have the interest, I'm too past this, past that. And God says, I can do miracles. So the point is, if you ask God, he can do miracles when you don't feel like it. Don't wait for your feelings to catch up with your actions. Pray for God to give you the actions or the feelings that can take you there. Here's another one. If you go through the Gospels, you find story after story of people being healed by Jesus or people experiencing Jesus. And when they experience Jesus, do they sit there and they think, oh, I don't really want to tell anyone about this. Or funny bone experience, I should tell people he raised me from the dead, but I don't really feel like doing it. Do you see that in the Bible? No? What do you see? You see people encountering Jesus, and what happens naturally? You tell everyone because you've had something incredible happen to you. It's not a $2 scratchy, right? This is life-changing. And so if you don't feel like doing evangelism, what could potentially be the root cause? What could be the issue? You haven't met Jesus. Because when people meet Jesus in the Bible, it is so good that they're ready. They sell all of their belongings, they leave their families behind, and they go tell people what Jesus has done. And if you haven't met Jesus, does that make you an evil, bad person? No, it doesn't. It just makes you a candidate for the kingdom. And today I want to talk to you about how you can experience Jesus, how you can meet Jesus, the living Savior. So we've just taken that question and found 5 different ways of answering it. Are you with me? And we've done that all through Bible stories. Now you might say, well, that's easy because you've done this before. Sure. But you know what? Next time it'll take you 5 hours, then 4, then 3, then 2. And then it will become quicker because you've got a very clear structure and you're just looking for some stories. And out of the Jonah story, I am not trying to find 20 points. How many points am I trying to find? 1. Because I can't remember more than 1 point and my audience can't remember more than 1 point. Okay, so we've got a story, the visualization. Visualization, a testimony. Can we think of some stories in our personal lives or that we know of people who have struggled with finding a reason for evangelism and then all of a sudden found one and found the motivation? Well, it might be your own. Why are you preaching this sermon? Because you've found a reason to share and you feel that others don't have that same passion. So share your own story. How many of you are born evangelists? How many of you were born wanting to tell people about Jesus? You weren't. What changed in your life? What did Jesus do for you that made you want to share him? When did you say to yourself, I don't want to go to do it, but someone encouraged you and you went door knocking or you went and shared with a friend or something happened, and by doing it, it actually changed your perspective on doing mission? It happens to us sometimes, right? I don't know what your story is. I can tell you my story. So share your story or someone else's that you know. And the application. What's the application that we want to land on? What do we want to encourage them to do? To move. Now, it could be that they are lethargic or they don't care. How do we move people to fall in love with Jesus? What is it going to take? What are the ways for people to experience Jesus in their lives?
Spend more time on the Word.
Okay, the Bible, actually reading the Word, and encourage people, hey, if you're feeling lethargic and you're not finding a reason, put it in your diary, put it in your calendar, get an accountability partner and talk to someone, and I just want you to read this parable together, or read this story, or just read this passage and reflect. Read it every day, this one verse, and just reflect on it. Reflect and pray and say, Lord, I don't feel like doing evangelism. And you know what? He already knows that. God doesn't look at you and say, you wicked child. He already knows you don't feel like sharing. And he knows why you don't feel like sharing, because you haven't encountered or met or experienced him, or not recently anyway. Because when you experience him recently, yeah, you feel like sharing with others something good that's happened to you. So read a verse. Or, hey, just pray with someone. Find an accountability partner and pray together. Or, you know what? Who wants to come out on a Bible study and experience what happens when we share? Because sometimes by doing, we catch the fire in the vision and it excites and enthuses us. And so this week, I'm going on 5 Bible studies. If you're feeling like you're struggling with evangelism, here are some slots. We'll find a way to make it work. You come with me and you see how people respond to the gospel when we share the gospel, whatever it is. But I'm giving them something very simple to do. You with me so far? Yeah? Now that was a pretty challenging topic. And how long did we spend time reflecting on how to structure that?
20 minutes.
Not even that. It's been about 10. So I think it was 11:39 when we started. So 11. Can you see how we can structure something that's quick, that flows, that's easy? And the more times you do it, you'll become more familiar with it. But it's not that hard, because I'm just looking for a story, a question, story, and then a challenge at the end. Making sense?
So what if what about a sermon on justification by faith?
Okay.
Would that fit into that, or that's...
Absolutely. But you see, if I get up there and I say we're preaching about justification by faith, half the church has no idea what you're talking about, because it's just a term that's foreign to them. And the other half have all sorts of weird and wonderful ideas about it that are convoluted and complex, and you're just going to actually get into a theological debate, because how you think you should be justified isn't how they think, and you mean this and you mean that. So instead of saying I'm preaching on justification by faith, I'm actually thinking, what need does justification by faith address? What is the actual personal need today in my life that it addresses? Can you think of it, or can anyone else think of justification by faith and how that helps me today? What does that do for me? Why is this important? Why is this going to change my life today? What does it do? How does it move me? Okay?
Well, it gives you assurance here.
Okay, so if it gives me assurance, then what don't I have? I don't have assurance. What does that look like? How do I feel when I don't have assurance?
Unworthy, not saved.
Okay, so I'm feeling unworthy. I'm feeling unsaved. I'm feeling like, every day I wake up and the moment I open my eyes, I'm already going backwards. I know I'm going to fail. Like, I wake up and I pray and I say, Lord Jesus, keep me alive and help me not sin and not do this. But I know, because yesterday was a bad day and today's going to be a bad day. And I feel bad about myself. And when I feel bad about myself, how do I usually treat other people? So, this flows into my spouse and my children and my colleagues, and it flows into people in the road. I don't like myself because I think God doesn't like me. I don't like myself. And when someone cuts me off on the road, I don't like them either. And we're just perpetuating people not liking each other. How do I deal with that? How do I work through that? This sense of unworthiness, this sense of I don't belong, this sense of I'm never good enough. How do I work through that? What's the solution to that? This is where we go to the Bible story. And you know what? I mean, I love theological terms, but you can share justification by faith without even calling it that. Because Abraham believed. And Acts chapter 16, the jailer wants to kill himself. Things are going really bad. He's about to be executed, so he's going to kill himself because Paul and Barnabas, he thinks, have escaped, or Paul and Silas? Barnabas. And then what does Paul say to him? He says, what must I do to be saved? He's desperate. He's anxious for some hope. And what does he say to him? Believe. Believe. So you can go through story after story where people have gone through what I'm going through, what you're going through, and there is a story in the Bible that answers this question. So think of the need rather than the topic. We're doing justification by faith. That's wonderful. What problem is it addressing in my life today? And if it doesn't address a problem in my life today, do you think I'm going to pay attention? It doesn't matter how good you present on justification by faith. If it doesn't hit the heart today, I couldn't care less. No, I don't mean that facetiously. I'm just going to tune out because I've got a phone with me and Facebook is pretty interesting. Any other questions, comments? Do you think this is doable? Yes. Do you think this is more doable? Have we moved a step closer to being more effective in sermon preparation and presentation? Yeah?
Half a step.
Half a step. Half a step is okay. We'll take half a step. It's better than where we were an hour ago, 55 minutes ago. If you're not sure, talk to one of your EPs and say, hey, I want to run through my stories with you. As I said, I'm always available, happy to chat, to talk. Where you're driving through, you send me an email and say, hey, here's a bit of an outline, does this work? More than happy to do that. And I promise you, because I've gone through this, when I switched from introduction, 3 points and a conclusion, it took me a few times because I was so stuck in the past. And I kept on wanting to give heavy theology. And I love theology. I did advanced Greek and advanced Hebrew at college, and I wanted to share that with everybody because what's the point of doing advanced Greek if you can't tell everybody about it, right? But it just wasn't reaching people's hearts. It wasn't impacting, it wasn't changing lives. And as much as I loved it, I'm like, preaching is not about me. It's not about me telling you how much I know. It's about moving you to this step because I've moved to this step. And I preach like this because I've moved. Yes. From introduction, 3 points there that I could remember, to this is going to be more engaging. It's going to be more captivating for your audience, and it's going to take me a lot less time to prepare. Does that make sense, Matthew?
So I've read somewhere that you should have mentioned the time while you're preaching, no reference to the clock or anything like that. And also, how much time do you leave for this?
I put it here, so 15 to 20 minutes probably here. You can do, 3 to 5 minutes here and 1 to 2 minutes here. Somewhere around the half-hour mark, plus or minus, depends how long your stories are. If you go for about half an hour, or if you go a little bit over, if you're telling stories, people are still going to stay engaged. If you're not telling stories, they're going to be looking at their watch and be like, it's lunchtime, he's gone over time, because that's what happens. How many of you watch a movie that's really engaging and you constantly look at the time? How many of you do that? You don't. What happens if you don't like the movie? What do you normally do? You turn it off, right? If you don't like it, and if you like it, you're not as concerned about the time. Now, be mindful. Don't go for an hour. Don't be silly. Don't do an hour and a half. A few weeks ago, I came across someone who recently, I think in one of our churches, went for 90 minutes. Don't do that. Be mindful of family and children and lunch, and that's why about 30 minutes is good enough. But if you go for 35, people are going to be very forgiving if they're engaged with your stories. Comment? There was another... Lorenzo.
Yeah, just a comment, like if you're in the practice of doing 3 points with another 3 points, and if you've been developing the sermons like that and you're struggling to transition to this, still go through that same 3-step process, but then ask the question, which one of those 3 points is going to speak the most to the need?
Really good point.
Just if you're not struggling with it, don't worry about it. But I mean, if it's something you're going to struggle with, and you're thinking, seeing this and going, well, how can I make that transition? Just a suggestion.
Appreciate that, Lorenzo. For those on camera, it was if you are used to doing 3 points, still do your 3 points, but then reflect and refine and say which one of these points is the main point. So, and stick to that one. Thank you, Lorenzo. Now, this is one way of doing it. There may be other ways. this is what works for me. You may find something that works better for you. But until you find something better, give this a try. And I think you'll be pleasantly surprised at how quick and easy it is to craft and how much more engaging it will be for the people that are listening to you. And on top of that, you'll be surprised to find that you are slowly actually moving people and they're making changes because you're giving them an opportunity and an invitation to do that. Any final questions?
When you get them to commit to baptism,
What was that, sorry?
is every sermon leading a person to baptism, or?
It depends on your people, it depends on the context. So not every sermon does. Some can. You know your audience, you know your congregation. And some are more attuned to that or more relevant to that. But every sermon needs to move people one step closer to Jesus. One step further than I'm here, now I'm here. And maybe at some points, because you know you have 3, 4, 5 people in your church who need to make that commitment for baptism, it may be that you do say, this sermon was for those of you who have been on the fence. And you're deciding, is it worth it? Is it not worth it? Well, we've just looked at a story that says it's worth it. There's nothing better than following Jesus. This is what happened for me. And today, if you want to get baptized, I want you to fill in this card or come up the front or do something else. So that could be where you do that as well.
But also, too, you're there to encourage the congregation, people you know, and to give them a lift, a spiritual lift,
You are.
to go for the next week, too.
And I really appreciate that you shared that, and we're almost done, but they're not done, so it's their fault. Yeah. I remember, every sermon is to move people forward, not to make people look back. Yeah. And there are 2 terms that I think we misuse in the church to get people to action. And the first one is guilt. Yes. Guilt is not from God. God does not bring guilt. Guilt makes us look inward and backward. Always. If you ever feel guilty, where is that emotion and that thought coming from? It's coming from the devil. And some of us struggle with guilt for a long time, and we go through life basically believing what the devil says. Why do we believe what he says? He is the father of lies. God does not bring guilt and does not make us look back. Because when you experience guilt and you look back, what do you see? Nothing good.
That's right, failure.
Failure. Disaster, which is why the devil wants to keep us there. God brings conviction and looking forward. So God doesn't come and say what an idiot you are. God says, I love you, and there is something in your life that if we change it, it's going to be so much better. Always moving us forward. And I've done it before. I have preached making people feel guilty, and I feel really good about myself. I'm like, that cut to the heart. I can see it. You know, they walk past and they shake my hand, but they've got their heads down in shame. Yeah. Jesus didn't do that for people. You know, Jesus encouraged him. Even with the Pharisees, he had tears in his eyes, and it was always, this is where you move. You have heard, but move here. It was said, but do this. Hey, you tithe this, but don't stop there. Also show mercy, goodness, and gentleness. So we preach to move people because that's what God does. He convicts to take us one step forward, not to make us wallow in guilt and self-despair and looking backwards. And I'm going to share this because I know some of us are struggling with guilt. We do that. If you've been an Adventist long enough, you're struggling with guilt because you just haven't met the standard. That does not come from God.
And that's depression too.
It leads us to that because it's
a gift of Satan.
Absolutely. When Jesus comes, it's look upward and look forward. When the devil comes, it's look inward and look backward. So just reflect. What are you doing? Are you looking inward and backward? That's the devil. You don't have to listen to his lies. He is a defeated foe. When Jesus comes, it's look upward. I have a good God. He loves me. He cares for me. And look forward because tomorrow is going to be better. This next second is going to be better because I'm alive and Jesus is alive. Now you had a question, Anna?
Yeah, with the need, it can be negative focused. And I think we should avoid that because that, where guilt can stem from that. And we're looking at people from a negative, position. And yeah, I don't know how to address that one need without having a negative approach.
So this is what I'd say. Problems are negative.
They are.
The solution is always going to be positive. But we're addressing an actual issue. If I go to the doctor, I want him to diagnose my problem. I want him to actually say, you've got something wrong. Something currently is causing you pain or hurting you. I'm not saying you're an idiot because you smoked all your life. Doctors don't do that. But they say your lungs are shot. That's negative, but the solution is positive. So I'm not too worried about saying, hey, the problems we're addressing are real problems, and they're negative things. Because if things are going well, I don't have a need.
But when people have the approach, well, you're making a judgment on me, that's not the way I think. I don't have that need.
That's okay. Then it doesn't relate to you. If it doesn't relate to you, then this sermon's not for you. That's why I spend time getting to know people and wanting to understand what the needs and the challenges are. You know, I tried not to go into specifics like, you know, you keep turning up late home from work and you miss dinner. Because I know a specific member that's got that particular issue, and they know and I know, and it's awkward. But I might say about how we treat our spouses, because many of us are struggling with having a good relationship. And I might frame that, instead of a need, I say to them, you know what, when you decided to get married, how many of you said, I just can't wait to have a mediocre marriage? How many of you got up and that was your goal? And at your wedding vows, you said, till death do us part, I promise we will be average. How many of you did that? None of you did that. But yet, how many of you are actually experiencing average? Your job and your time and your money stresses and communication issues and children and work and neighbours. You know what? Don't put your hand up, but would it be fair to say that most of us aren't writing books on how to have a happy marriage? Would that be a fair comment? So if we're not writing those books, do you think God had average in mind for us when he created Adam and Eve? And the two shall be average. Do you think that's what he said? No, it wasn't. This was the crowning act of creation. So if you have an average marriage, we're going to look at a biblical solution. And then we're going to take one more step on how you can go from mediocrity to a better marriage, And my goal is in 2 years, all of you are writing marriage books. Not because of me, but because Jesus is alive, and Jesus did not create you for mediocrity.